Welcome to In the Spotlight. I'm Abigail Pogrebin. Ruth Franklin is with me today. She is a book critic and former editor at the New Republic. Her first biography, Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography and was named a New York Times Notable Book of 2016. Ruth's work appears in many publications, including The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, and Harper's. She is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Biography, a Cullman Fellowship at the New York Public Library, a Leon Levy Fellowship in Biography, and the Roger Shattuck Prize for Criticism. Her first book, A Thousand Darknesses, Lies and Truth in Holocaust Fiction, was a finalist for the Sammy Rohr Prize of Jewish Literature. Her latest book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank, is luminous and shattering, and we're going to talk about it today. It was published in January 2025. Welcome, Anne.
Thanks so much for having me here.
Great to be with you, and it's really an extraordinary book. And of course, I'm sure you've been asked this before, why another book on Anne Frank? There's been so much written about her and about the play about her and then the movie adaptation. What is new about this? I have my own feelings about what makes this so kind of surprising and fresh, but tell me.
Well, so The Diary of Anne Frank is a touchstone book for so many of us who read it growing up, read it in school. And researching this book, I collected so many stories of people around the world who were affected and influenced by this book in fascinating ways. And yet, at the same time, I think there's a sense in which we don't know the real Anne Frank. She's been obscured by all the myth-making around her image and also around the diary itself. So I first got interested in probing deeper into that book in the 90s when it started to make news, when missing pages from the diary resurfaced. The fact that she had edited the diary herself was starting to become public knowledge. And yet I was noticing that nobody seemed to be aware of this. And yet at the same time, she grows more and more iconic. Her face is on billboards. She's invoked in all kinds of political contexts to make different points. You know, whenever there's a diary of somebody published during war, that person is said to be the new Anne Frank in some way or another. And I wanted to put those pieces together to get back to who was the actual girl Anne Frank, this person, this historical person who lived, and how is she related to the icon that she became?
You also really take us through the experience of Dutch Jewry leading up to the war and during the war, and I had never seen kind of the canvas of that laid out so starkly. I mean, it's kind of a drip of harrowing, like the walls are closing in, or I should say the noose is tightening, where, you know, rights are taken away and privileges and this, just normal life gets more and more narrow and constrained. Can you just talk about how you approached that research?
Absolutely. I felt it was really important to draw a picture of what was going on, not only for Anne herself, which she narrates so unforgettably herself through the diary, but also what was going on that she didn't know about. What was going on outside the walls of the annex while they're in hiding, you know, and of course also what happened to her afterwards, after the raid on the annex in August 1944, and the diary ends, and what happened to her in the camps. And it was a story that I also wasn't that familiar with before I started researching this book. I've been reading about the Holocaust all my life. I wrote another book about Holocaust literature, and yet the story of what happened to the Jews in the Netherlands is really unique. It's totally different from the way the Holocaust took place in Eastern Europe, you know, in the former Soviet territories. Just its own, you know, cast of characters and procedures, and I felt that the reader really needed to know these missing pieces of Anne's story.
I also didn't realize that Otto Frank, Anne's father, had tried so mightily to get them out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
That is such a fascinating part of the story. So in the 2000s, a researcher at YIVO in Manhattan, the Jewish Library, found a file containing letters from Otto Frank that he had written to his friends in the United States and to American refugee committees, trying to get a visa or visas to bring his entire family to America. This was in 1941. And it's such a sad story and, you know, a frightening story to be reading now. So when we are experiencing some of the similar forces of xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment in this country, to read about how just as all of these Jews were seeking so desperately to escape Nazi-occupied Europe, the U.S. was tightening its immigration policies, tightening its quotas against these enemy aliens who actually, were feared to be a kind of a fifth column for Germany in the United States, which, when we look back on it now, that seems a preposterous idea.
And you're saying that was the feeling about Jews.
Exactly, that these Jewish immigrants were somehow going to become spies for Germany. It's totally ludicrous.
One of the people he was writing to was Strauss. I forget his.
That's right, Nathan Strauss, the
Strauss
Scion,
department store.
Exactly.
And it seems like he's kind of willing to help, and then it's kind of like, well, if I'm going to spend this much money on you, there's all these other people who also want me to spend this money. Like the idea that even someone who has good intentions kind of has a limit to how far they'll go to help.
And not only that, but Nathan Strauss was Otto's friend from their college days. They had met when Nathan Strauss was studying abroad in Germany, which was where the Franks were originally from. And they were close friends. They were best friends. And not only that, but Nathan Strauss was the heir to the Macy's department store fortune and an official in the Roosevelt government. So there couldn't be a person who was better connected, with more resources to help the Franks get these visas. And yet there was, you're right, as you say, there was some kind of waffling back and forth. But in the end, Strauss and his wife, who also came from a very wealthy family, did commit 100% to trying to get Otto and his family out. And even they couldn't do it, which I think just says so much about these labyrinthine policies and how the U.S. really made it impossible for Jews to escape from Europe.
The fact that there are 4 versions was a revelation to me. 4 versions of the diary. Can you just very briefly, because I want people to read the book and discover it for themselves, but what do you mean by 4 versions?
4 versions of the diary. I'll do this as simply as possible. So there's Anne's original version, which is called by scholars version A. That's, the diary as she wrote it, day by day, not every day, not consistently, but the diary that she kept starting on her 13th birthday and continuing for just over 2 years in hiding. And then in March 1944, she heard a minister from the Dutch government in exile on the radio call for citizens to preserve their documents of the war years for a future national archive. And that seems to be the first time that she really thought that her diary could have an audience, a public audience. And she went back to the beginning and rewrote it on new paper from the start. And that version is called version B. It's Anne's own
just so we understand,
edit.
she hears a minister on the radio, because they used to listen clandestinely to the radio, saying, save your documents, preserve this history somehow. And she thinks to herself, maybe my diary could be an artifact.
That's right, absolutely. But she realizes that the diary as she's written it isn't quite going to work as a document of testimony because, number one, it's too personal. This version A, this rough draft, has all kinds of stuff about, her girlfriends, her boyfriends, her classmates, her crushes. Oh, yeah. And she didn't want to include all this material in her document of testimony. And then secondly, I think she must have realized that it didn't have quite enough about the actual persecution of the Jews. So in her edit, in her version B, her revision, she goes back and she adds new entries with more information about exactly what the Nazis were doing to the Jews at the time.
And I kind of love, because I actually did this myself, where I rewrote my diary at one point.
Wow.
I'm ashamed to admit it. But it had that same impulse of, like, you read yourself and you're like, oh, I can't. I sound ridiculous. I sound sophomoric, whatever. The term is, you want to make it kind of sound better for posterity in some way. You're almost ashamed of your youth.
That's right. And there are even places in the original diary where she wrote notes to herself saying, like a year and a half later, we know because she wrote the date of the note, she'll look back on her former entries and write things like, I can't believe I ever felt this way. So that's version B, Anne's edit. And then after the war, so the diary was left behind in the annex when the Nazis raided it and recovered by Miep Gies and Beb Voskuil, 2 of the secretaries from Otto's company who helped sustain the family in hiding. They're known as the helpers. They returned to the annex after the raid to see if there were any valuables left, and they found Anne's diary there on the floor where the Nazis had left it. They gathered up all the pages, hoping that Anne would return and that they would be able to return the diary to her. But when it turned out that Otto, in fact, was the only survivor of the 8 people in the annex, Miep gave the papers to him, saying, "This is your daughter's legacy to you," which I find just such a moving story. And so now Otto realizes, I think, just about right away that he wanted to publish the diary, that it was worth publishing. But you ask, why couldn't he just publish Anne's version? Well, for one thing, she didn't finish it. It wasn't quite finished by the time she had gotten, by the time the Nazis read it. But also she had taken out things that he thought should be put back in. One of them being her romance with Peter. And I think this is the part that's so unbelievable, because of all the things, that we remember most from reading this book, it's the romance that kind of gives it its spark, and also, of course, makes it so relatable and so endearing. Anne took all of these entries about her crush on Peter out because they didn't, I guess, contribute to the testimonial purpose that she meant for her work to have, and Otto put them back in. So the version that, you and I and probably many people grew up reading as children, basically the version of the diary that was published in the US and elsewhere up until the mid-90s, that was version C, Otto's edit.
And what's the fourth?
So the fourth, there is yet a version D. And this is the version that you might be, I think, most likely to see if you go to a bookstore today and look for the diary. It's known as the definitive edition. I personally don't think that there can be a definitive edition of Anne's diary for this reason exactly, that there are all these different versions. But it's a new version, that it's sort of a new edit, a director's cut, you could call it, that was put together by the Anne Frank Foundation and another editor after the material that was in Anne's original version A was discovered and first published. So it's a new version that incorporates some more of the material that Anne originally left out. But it's not actually her original version.
Okay. The pieces that I'm sure surprise a lot of people are the sexual discussions about being attracted to a woman, to a girl. And was that something that Anne, it was Jacqueline, right? Am I
That's
right?
right.
Is that something that Anne had taken out? Did Otto also take it out? Where did that land?
Yeah, so that was part of an entry that Anne originally took out. There's a passage that Anne writes in January 1944. It's a pretty long entry that touches on a lot of different things, including her relationship with her mother. But there's a passage in it where she remembers having gone to a sleepover. This would have been 2 years earlier, say, back before they went into hiding, having a sleepover with her best friend, Jacqueline. And Anne's very curious about puberty and her developing body, and she asks Jacqueline if they can touch each other's breasts. And Jacqueline says no. And that's the end of it. And this passage has been seized upon by a lot of conservative activists who have used it as a reason to remove the diary from school libraries and curricula, saying that this is, inappropriate LGBTQ content that doesn't belong in school libraries. And part of what they say is that this is new stuff that got added by other people. But in fact, that's wrong. That was in Anne's original version, and nobody made a big deal out of it, of course, because it's
like
perfectly normal.
Yeah. Anne's mom, is it Edith? Am I right? She seemed to be a little bit less well liked by Anne than her dad, Otto. And then when I think Anne rereads it, as you tell it, she almost seems to feel a little bit guilty about some of what she wrote about her mom. Tell me about that.
That's right. There are passages where she goes back and she kind of reworks her own criticism of her mother.
And does Otto rework her criticism?
Again, in a very minor way. And I think people do have this perception that Otto is like a censor of Anne's diary.
Yeah, I remember that, having some sense that he actually, in some way, kind of bastardized it.
Right, and it's just not true. Yeah. And he the only time that he ever talked about the edits that he made and why he made them was once in an interview with a journalist. Because remember that this critical edition, in which all of these different versions were published for the first time, didn't appear until years after he had died. So while Otto was alive, nobody knew that he had edited the diary in this way. The only time he ever talked about it was he said that he tried to think through what Anne would have wanted done if she had survived and been around to publish it. And I think that's so important. So, there's this perception that he took out her criticism of her mother. It's just not true. He softened it a little bit, but it's all there in that version we read as kids. That he took out stuff about her feelings about her body, and that's just not true either. But the thing you have to remember, I think, and what he was trying to do is, this is a man who survived Auschwitz at this point. And he's thinking about these people who he spent all this time in hiding with. None of them are there anymore. He's thinking about them in a different way. And I think he's imagining that Anne would have thought of them in a different way too, if she had survived. And what we know actually is that, of course, Anne was in Auschwitz with her mother, along with Mrs. Van Pels, Peter's mother, the wife of the other family who were in hiding with them, who Anne is so critical of in the diary, really more than her mother. And people who knew them in the camps said that later, when Anne and Margot, her sister, and Mrs. Van Pels were transferred to Bergen-Belsen, Edith at this point is left behind in Auschwitz where she dies, that they were so close that other people thought that Mrs. Van Pels was Anne and Margot's mother. And I think, that just tells you so much. We just can't assume that anything would have been the same after the war.
It really was incredible. I keep saying it was incredible, but so many things were revelations, that there is documentation of people who were with Anne. I didn't realize that there were so many who could give testimony to having been with her, seen her, moments that really stand out. And also you describe, I think, in ways that are obviously very difficult to read, but just the reality of what, I can't even call it existence, was like, because it was not existence.
It was really important to me to draw as complete as possible a picture of what Anne went through in the camps for a lot of reasons, but one of which is that the diary has sometimes been criticized as almost, not a real book about the Holocaust.
Right, it's too sunny.
Right, because it ends, it ends before Anne is a prisoner in the camp. It's too, it's cozy, it's kind of cozy, they're in hiding and everything, but they're together as a family. Nothing really terrible happens. Of course, all that happens later. And so some people have criticized the diary and said that, people who read it and think that this is what the Holocaust was all about are, they're deluding themselves. They're turning away from the real horror of it. And I wanted my book to express that real horror. And so, there is some testimony from people who knew Anne in the camps and remembered seeing her there, other Dutch women especially, and young women who are around Anne's age. But in order to kind of fill out that picture, I also read a lot of testimonies by women who had experienced Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen at around the same time that Anne had been there. And so, there's no place that I make up something or that, I say that something that happened to somebody else happened to Anne. But I use their testimonies to kind of fill out the picture of what the situation in those camps was like, especially for women, because I think that's something also that a lot of people don't appreciate, was that it was just a little bit different to be a prisoner of the Nazis for women than it was for men.
The adaptation into a play is just a book unto itself. It's riveting to me. Let's just talk about Meyer Levin for a minute. He writes the New York Times review. It's a glowing front page review. They don't think that this book, Doubleday the publisher doesn't think the book's going to do very much.
Not only that, but they allocate zero advertising funds to it. Zero.
Wow.
They're not planning to advertise the book.
And did you say what the first printing was, or?
It was in the low thousands.
Wow.
I don't remember the number off the
So
top
when
of
does
my
it
head.
explode?
3,000 maybe.
It explodes after the review in the Times. People start buying it, and it kind of almost goes viral in today's terms. In terms of how does the play actually develop? Because it isn't like one person says, I'm going to write this play. There's kind of a little bit of a tussle.
It's complicated. The fight over who would adapt the Diary of Anne Frank is, I think, one of the most contentious aspects of Anne's legacy and one of the least understood. So there's Meyer Levin, who, as you say, wrote this cover review of the diary. And he actually was friendly with Otto Frank. He read the book in its French translation when he was living in Paris and reached out to Otto Frank to help find a New York and American publisher. And the book at that point had been rejected by around a dozen English language publishers. And so Meyer Levin is sort of acting as an unofficial agent. As it turned out, the book made its way to Doubleday without his help. but he's still kind of seeing himself as an advocate for the book. So there's a little bit of a conflict of interest that he reviews it for the New York Times. So we'll just, set that part aside. And so later he always said that Otto Frank promised him that sort of in exchange for all his advocacy work for the diary, he would be allowed to adapt it for Broadway. That was, in fact, it was his vision. Otto Frank really wanted the diary to reach the greatest number of people possible. He wanted Anne's voice and her message to go out into the world with the widest possible audience. But he was anxious about the idea of a play, I think because of the sense that a play would inevitably fictionalize the story a little bit. And that made him anxious for all the obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And it was Meyer Levin who convinced him that a Broadway play would be really essential, and that if he wanted to disseminate Anne's message,
this was the way
Broadway play was how. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll let people follow on just the extraordinary ride of that. I just want to step back and talk about the Jewishness of Anne, because it's obviously been a great point of contention how universalized her story has been. And when people go to the Anne Frank house, they're coming from all over the world, and that the message is one against prejudice and hate kind of globally, universally, and not necessarily specifically Jewishly, in terms of anti-Semitism, in terms of hatred against Jews. Can you just talk about, from all of this research you did in this book, which is tremendous, what's your feeling about kind of the allergy to universalizing her?
So that brings us back again to this Broadway play, because that's the main criticism levied against this adaptation, which in the end wasn't done by Meyer Levin, but was done by the Hollywood screenwriter couple, Frances Goodrich and Albert Hackett, who weren't Jews. And they produced a play that does kind of downplay Anne's identity as a Jew. There's very little in the way of Jewish ritual or conversation about it, and there's this notorious passage where Anne talks about all people, various different groups around the world, all having suffered prejudice at different times, sometimes the Jews, sometimes other people. It's a passage that is not in the diary. In fact, she says the opposite. She points out how Jews have historically been singled out as targets of prejudice and persecution.
And that was very intentional that line was added.
Yes, it was absolutely intentional. My book kind of gets into the extent to which we can know who exactly was responsible for this and why, but it's clear that there was indeed a wish to universalize Anne's message and make it about prejudice, writ large, and not specifically anti-Semitism. And a lot of this came from Otto Frank himself. He actually said to Meyer Levin, when Levin was working on his ill-fated adaptation, he said, "This is not a Jewish book, so don't make a Jewish play out of it." And we read this now and we're like, what? This is not a Jewish book. Anne Frank's diary is not a Jewish book. What did he mean? And in fact, Otto then a few lines later in this letter says, but at the same time, it must be a Jewish play so that it continues to work against anti-Semitism. I think it's fascinating to see that, even then he understood the terrible bind that was going to happen. This tension between the desire to make the diary as universal as possible, applicable to all kinds of people, relatable in the way that we see so many people identifying with Anne and taking up her story, and yet if we truly interpret it as a comment on any kind of prejudice, it gets us into all kinds of uncharted territory. And so my own sense is that we really kind of have to go back to the message of that letter, that it, on the one hand, it's not just a book for Jews, it's a book for everyone. Lots of people can read this story and find something important to take away from it, but it has, at the same time, it has to retain its Jewish character because, as we know, anti-Semitism is still a force in our world.
The most famous line, in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart.
Yes.
What should we make of that line after the deep dive you've taken?
So I think it's important to recognize, first of all, that line is just one line and it appears in a passage that complicates it a little bit, where Anne talks about, she says, I still believe that people are really good at heart, but at the same time, I feel the thunder approaching, I feel the suffering of millions, our world is, in a catastrophe. But at the same time, a lot of people have criticized this line as naive, if not to say superficial. and have said that if Anne who had experienced the concentration camps would never have been able to say this. She would not have still believed that people were still good at heart after experiencing Auschwitz. My own position is that we can't really know. And I truly hesitate to impute any position to Anne that she didn't directly express herself. But I think it's instrumental to see the way people around the world, again, have been inspired by that passage. And one case that I talk about in the book is the case of these anti-apartheid activists in South Africa who were in prison on Robben Island, which is an extremely isolated place.
I've been there.
Have you really? Well. And somehow they got a copy of the diary in prison and were passing it around and copying out passages. And that's one of the ones that they copied out. And reading that, I just had to think that, in a position like these people who are trying to rebuild their society from the ground up, they have to believe that people are really good at heart, right? And in that way, it's not a naive belief. It's kind of revolutionary.
Yeah, it's a choice.
Yeah, exactly.
Ruth Franklin, thank you for this book. It's called The Many Lives of Anne Frank. I hope everyone gets a copy, and I mean that heartily. I am Abigail Pogrebin for In the Spotlight. Good to be with you, and I'll see you next time.